join us today, and they'll be talking to us as we speak.
Thank you. Well, it's definitely my honor and pleasure to be with the second best commander in the neighborhood. I knew that would keep you all awake. But I'm going to be speaking today about Midway and the role of U.S. naval intelligence in the Battle of Midway. Quote, "The fate of the nation quite literally depended upon about a dozen men who had devoted their lives and careers in peace and war to radio intelligence." So wrote Rear Admiral Edwin Layton in his book, and I was there, titled, "Was There Something Unique to the Japanese That Lost Them the Battle of Midway?" Dr. James Libby, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, wrote that we military historians have a tendency to obsess over the causes of victory and defeat in war. However, like economists, we have a profound desire to identify those actions that ensure success or generate failure, and like economists, we are not overtly good at it. Now, Levy references several historians who place blame on the Japanese for being too conceited. One wrote that the Japanese commanders were too arrogant and intransigent. Another wrote the Japanese were stricken by victory disease. And most historians have said that Admiral Yamato's plan was too complex and grandiose. Others, such as Parcel and Tully in their book Shattered Sword, I'm sure many of you have read that, use their collective understanding of anthropology to place blame on Japan's defeat, with Japanese society's value of conformity and obedience over creativity or personal initiative. In other words, Japanese naval strategy was influenced at the very beginning by Oriental philosophies on the conduct of war. It was because of their inborn nature that the Japanese strategy to defeat the U.S. Navy and take Midway was, in one word, warped. Well, Levy writes, he says, perhaps it was warped. Perhaps the Japanese were all of the above, and that it was the underpinning to the Japanese Naval High Command's judgment. However, in a very recent article published in the spring 2015 issue of the Naval War College Review, written by Anthony Tully and Dr. Liu Yu, they state that the failure of intelligence on the Japanese side was centered more on Yamato and the combined fleet staff's choice. Their choices that the intelligence that they had on us was not transmitted to Admiral Nagumo and Kaido Butai, the Japanese carrier force, and no attempts were made to confirm that they were aware of it. Now, Levy also wrote in 2014, he said, it wasn't so much the Japanese losing, but yet maybe, just maybe, it was probably perhaps the Americans were very good and very lucky. They are the reason why they won. Yes, the Americans were very good and very lucky. Then again, I would characterize luck to intuition and instinct. What Levy did not mention, although I believe he assumed it, was the role of U.S. naval intelligence played in the American victory. This is said as much by Elliot Carlson's brilliant biography, Joe Rocheford's War. Who's read that? Oh, by the way, Mr. Carlson will be our guest speaker at our Army-Navy Club Pearl Harbor Midway dinner this coming Thursday, which he'll be introduced by the prospective Chief of Naval Operations, Andrew Richard. Now, before discussing that aspect of the role that U.S. naval intelligence played in the battle, let us explore the evolutionary process that became naval operational intelligence for the United States. For centuries, naval commanders relied upon two roughly distinct but complementary levels of information and subsequent intelligence. The first was strategic in nature. It was what governments were able to discern through secret agents as to what the enemy intended. whilst the second source of information and finished intelligence was very much the naval commanders to develop. This was usually through direct observation of the enemy's force structure and their operations. And what I consider a masterpiece of scholarship and required reading for all naval intelligence professionals is Professor Steve Maffio's book, Most Secret and Confidential, Intelligence in the Age of Nelson. Steve is a fellow naval intelligence officer. He just retired this year as the head historian at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He wrote that naval intelligence almost exclusively was in the hands of the senior officer present, for he was most often the only one with enough experience to evaluate it. Our Navy's early years mirrored that of Britain and other Western maritime nations. During the American War for Independence, Benjamin Franklin, while serving as minister of the French court, operated a sizable naval intelligence section in addition to his diplomatic staff. With the Republic, naval intelligence collection continued. Ironically, in 1819, with the arrival of Commodore Charles Stewart's flagship, the USS Franklin, of 80 guns, to Portsmouth, England, the Commodore entertained Royal Navy and Russian Navy officers on board the Franklin. Alternatively, he and his officers were invited aboard their ships. He gathered significant information and intelligence and passed it back to the Secretary of the Navy. Another example was that then of Secretary of the Navy Southern, who in 1827 requested U.S. ambassadors and ministers to collect information respecting the naval forces of Great Britain or other nations as you may be able to procure without inconvenience. It was not until 1882 that the Office of Naval Intelligence was established with a gifted linguist, Lieutenant Theodore Mason, as its first head. With his appointment came the first official directive to U.S. Naval Intelligence attachés to begin an active and continuous collection effort against other maritime nations. Now, U.S. Naval Intelligence began, and I should say, in this case, the Royal Naval Intelligence, began its transformation with the industrial era and with a corresponding electronic revolution. In his seminal book, Century of U.S. Naval Intelligence, Captain Wyman Packard wrote that, quote, a relatively new intelligence concept came into its own subsequent to the development of the radio. By the time of the Great War, the Royal Navy had already developed a rudimentary communications intelligence, or common capability. It became it became known as Room 40. The Admiralty's Cryptographic Bureau routinely intercepted German naval radio traffic, and through direction finding, traffic analysis, and code breaking, they were able to obtain a broad understanding of German naval operations. As Ford and fellow companion David Rosenberg wrote in their book, The Admiral's Advantage, the capability came just in time to play a pivotal role against the new naval threat presented by German submarines. However, the extent of this capability was handicapped by the Admiralty's reluctance to merge this capability with the Admiralty's operational staff. Intel operations separate. In 1917, with America's entry into the war, Royal Navy and French Navy operational intelligence was made available to U.S., making it unnecessary for O&I to become extensively involved in processing operational intelligence. However, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, directed, quote, the collection and compilation of prompt, reliable, and accurate information concerning the approach, arrival, movements, and position of enemy forces, and the prompt dissemination of the above information to the Commandant of the relevant naval district, the Department of the Navy, and the fleet operating in associated waters. With the Second World War looming, the British rectified the gulf between operational intelligence and that of operations with the first genuine Operational Intelligence Center, or OIC. As Ford and Rosenberg wrote, The OIC was truly revolutionary. As Ford and Rosenberg wrote, excuse me, that's what they wrote. Patrick Beasley wrote in his book, Very Special Intelligence, that the Royal Navy's OIC became the coordinating center for all information from whatever sources with full responsibility for analysis and evaluation. Arguably, it became the single most effective intelligence organization in the Second World War. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy did not have an OIC of its own. The Navy's intelligence capability was found at the Navy staff level and was divided into two distinct organizations. Now, the first was O&I. As an organization, it had two functions. One, gathering primarily strategic information which came from separate fleet intelligence officers and naval attachés. And second, protecting naval installations against sabotage. And this required O&I to coordinate with the FBI. As Captain Packard wrote, consequently, when the U.S. entered the war, O&I was unprepared to provide timely intelligence to operational commands. Now, the second part was found in the Office of Naval Communications, or ONC. Besides being responsible for all Navy communications, it possessed a common organization. This was established in 1924 and was designated as Op 20G, with Commander Lawrence Safford as its first OIC. He was joined by Miss Agnes Driscoll and as Craig Simons, who is the historian emeritus at the Naval Academy. He wrote in his book, The Battle of Midway, he said, she all but invented the science of cryptology and trained most of the men who later would play such a crucial role in American code breaking. Now, it was Safford in 1925 recruited a young Mustang officer from Southern California named Joe Rochefort, and together with Agnes Driscoll, formed the backbone of the Navy's code-breaking capability. The reason for standing up this organization with ONC was for the purpose of breaking the Japanese naval code. It was in the 1920s that the U.S. started to pay attention, extremely serious attention, to the Japanese code. It was designated as JN1, or Japanese Naval Code Number 1. And during the interwar years, the Japanese constantly changed the code, with the 25th version coming as JN25, coming out in 1940. As one can imagine, Navy code breakers had to start from scratch every time. And 1 year before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese created a new version, which was designated by ONC as JN25B. Now, to enhance this effort, this is back in the 20s and 30s, Safford, who established two satellite radio intercept stations. One in Manila in 1932 called Station Cast, and the other Station Hypo in Hawaii in 1936. That was Safford who sent Joe Rochefort to Hawaii in 1940. Now, a third person that would form a relationship that can be said changed the course of history was then Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, and he was SINPAC's Police Intelligence Officer. Layton and Rochefort were extremely good friends. They had served together in Japan, learning Japanese as well as Japanese culture. This was in the 1920s. Now, together, they quickly began to bypass the bureaucratic structure, and Rochefort was going directly to Layton with his findings. Now, you're wondering why that was the case. Well, as I mentioned, we have two very rival organizations, O&I and ONC. And as I said, this was an extremely fractured situation. This led to a constant bureaucratic battle between these two. And this ongoing dispute ran all the way through 1940, through 1941. Now, the Director of Naval Communications argued that it was ONC's responsibility to present the more interesting translations to the Secretary of the Navy. Director of Naval Intelligence argued that it was O&I's responsibility to take translations and to evaluate and then interpret them by O&I experts. and that O&I should brief the Secretary of the Navy and disseminate it to the fleet. Now, as I mentioned, in 1940, this endemic problem was only exacerbated by then Captain Richmond K. Turner, who was at the time director of the Navy Staff's War Plans Division. He argued rather strongly to the C&O, Admiral Stark, that it was O&I's job to provide their piece of intelligence regarding enemy intentions to Turner, whilst the War Plans Division would evaluate and interpret all information from whatever source, to include O&C's translations. Now, Rochefort was directly responsible through the district, Naval District, to O&C. And it would be the War Plans Division that would send the finished intelligence products to the fleet and provide the daily briefings to the Secretary of the Navy. Now, this was approved by Admiral Stark. And this fractured process was in operation at the time of Pearl Harbor. Now, you can imagine this had a trickle-down effect with subordinate commands. Organizationally, the Fleet Radio Unit Station Hypo fell within the chain of command of the 14th Naval District and not to SINCPAC Fleet Headquarters. And it was required to report its findings to O&C's Op 20G. And Op 20G would then provide the information to the War Plans Division. But Rochefort saw his responsibility was also to report to SINCPAC Fleet related. Now, as all of us know, code breaking can only work if code breakers have enough intercept messages to work with. Additionally, code breaking capabilities enhanced through the art of traffic analysis. Traffic analysis builds the picture by establishing a pattern as to the enemy's force structure and its movements. Traffic analysis are aided by cryptologists' ability to break the code. The relationship is further affected by the amount of signals intelligence intercepted. Too few signals received stymies both disciplines, and too much overwhelms, both requiring traffic analysis and cryptology to determine what is important and what is not. Therefore, running up to Pearl Harbor, Rochefort and his team of codebreakers and those of Station Cast relied very much on their own insights and painstaking work. Excuse me. As such, their code-breaking efforts on any given radio message intercept were fragmentary, possessing gaps, some with significant gaps. Compound this by the fact that there was a division of labor. Hypo was instructed to work on the little-used Japanese Admiral's Code, whilst Cast was working on the operational code. An unfortunate consequence of Pearl Harbor was that senior Navy leadership saw Cast and Hypo as having failed to give the Pearl Harbor warning. This lack of trust required Layton and Rochefort to convince the new SINCPAC, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, that it was not the fault of Hypo, and that they, Layton and Rochefort, could create an organization that could provide Nimitz with the intelligence of where the Japanese would act next. As a team, Layton and Rochefort were able to convince Nimitz, but for Big Navy, it was a different story. In stepped the Redmond brothers. One was an admiral, the head of O&C, and he assigned his brother, his younger brother, to be, at that time captain, the head of Op 20G. There would exist a tremendous amount of friction and distrust by them towards Rochefort and his team. This friction would come to a head with Rochefort being dismissed from Hypo in October 1942. After the battle for the Coral Sea, in which Rochefort's team had predicted that the Japanese were going to strike south towards Port Moresby, they had another breakthrough. On 8 May, it became clear that Admiral Nagumo's carrier battle force, the Kaido Butai, returned to home waters. Rochefort informed Nimitz in Washington that something was brewing. It was at this point in time that Hypo was receiving up to 1,000 radio messages per day. Now, Rochefort only had a team of 20 people. They were only able to translate about 25% of all Japanese Navy radio traffic. In retrospect, considering the small number of personnel, this was really astonishing. Running up through April and May of 1942, Rochefort and his core team were working 20 to 22 hours per day. As for Lieutenant Commander Tom Dyer, who was Rochefort's senior cryptologist, he was taking uppers and downers just to keep going. 5 days later, on 13 May, a turning point occurred that pushed the debate even further. And as you can imagine, the friction between Washington and Hawaii. Namely, that Redmond's group was certainly unconvinced by what Hypo was assessing. Rochefort's team decrypted an Imperial Navy's message pointing directly to Midway Atoll and not to Hawaii or the Aleutian Islands as the objective for Nagumo's Kaido Butai. Two elements of the message that were intercepted on 13 May were extremely striking. The translated letters AF was a clear geographic reference, and the translated letter K stood for campaign. All on Rochefort's staff concurred that AF was Midway. Rochefort called Layton, and he said, "I've got something hot, so hot that it's burning the top off of my desk. The man with the blue eyes needs to see it now." I'm sure many of you know about the classic bait that Rochefort used to substantiate AF was Midway, the busted freshwater distillation plant on Midway. But what really put the nail in the coffin was the transmissions the Japanese Navy made preceding the second air raid on Pearl Harbor on 4 March 1942, using two gigantic 4-engine Emily flying boats. In one intercepted and decoded message, the Japanese Naval Headquarters directed the planes to avoid AF because the Americans maintained an air search radar station on AF. The only air search radar outside of Hawaii was on Midway. The next to be identified was the date and time of the attack, as well as the Japanese naval order of battle. And that proved much harder to crack. Layton reviewed the intelligence of the previous 3 weeks. He brooded over the charts and studied the Pacific winds and weather and currents. He and Rochefort compared notes again, and the conclusion was the Kaido Butai would strike Midway on the morning of 4 June, and that, quote, "they'll come in from the northwest at a bearing of 325 degrees, and they will be sighted about 175 miles from Midway, and at the time will be about 0600 Midway time." After seeing Rochefort and Layton's analysis, Nimitz's chief of staff, Captain McCormick, reported back to Nimitz and said he was convinced that Rochefort was correct. Nimitz believed. One can imagine that many, thinking the completeness of the intelligence assessment was an effort to mistrust, or I should say mislead, the Americans as to the real objective of such a concentration of Japanese naval combat power. There was that thought back at Navy that this was a rouge. On Sunday evening, 17 May, after considerable discussion between the Redmonds and King on the veracity of Rochefort's and Layton's assessment, Nimitz received a signal from King stating that he concurred with Nimitz's assessment, although King recommended to Nimitz that he should be mindful that the Japanese may try to lay a trap at what was left of the Pacific Fleet and destroy it. So you had that little counter. Big Navy knows. With this intelligence, Nimitz was now in a position to act, and he directed his 3 remaining carriers and their escorts to sail to a position north and east of Midway, and hopefully set a trap for the oncoming Kaido Butai. The morning of 3 June, Nimitz and his staff were at their stations. Radio intercepts from the Japanese off the Aleutians were pouring in. Then around Midway, the cable telegraph, undersea telegraph between Midway and Hawaii came to life. Catalina flying boats found the assault force. and found it at 0600. With Layton in the room, Nimitz smiled and said to him, quote, "This ought to make your heart warm. This will clear up all the doubters now. They just have to know that what I told them is correct." Now, shortly after the battle, Nimitz agreed with Layton and Rochefort that an operational intelligence center should be created. Big Navy had also come to the same conclusion, and during the summer of 1942, the Intelligence Center Pacific area, or ICPOA, was established, with Joe Rochefort as its first OIC. Now, however, this didn't really end happily for Joe. He had caused too much friction. Redmond pulled him out of ICPOA prior to Guadalcanal, and Rochefort never went back to operational intelligence. Yes, maybe, just maybe, the Japanese did not lose the battle. They had aspects of intelligence that could have confirmed that the American carriers were waiting for them. However, I think it could be said that the Americans possessed the intuition and instinct. The code breakers, the intelligence analysts who placed all the information into meaningful context, the decision makers who trusted the intelligence, the men that fought the ships and submarines, the men who flew and maintained the aircraft, and the men who named Midway's defenses. Cannot true glory go to all? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, right up here.
Thank you.
All right, on behalf of the Naval Order of San Francisco Commandery, Naval Order of the United States of America, we would like to thank our guest speaker today, and sincerely thank you very much for taking the time.